Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Lieutenant Commander Iram Hassan. So this session will discuss changes in the conduct of clinical activities and inspection activities post-pandemic and the adoption of regulatory flexibilities. So we're gonna explore insights gained from post-pandemic inspections conducted from all of our international regulatory agencies, FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada. So I have the privilege to introduce our speakers for this session. So first we'll have Jason Wakilan-Smith speaking. He's an expert GCP inspector and head of compliance expert circle for MHRA. Jason has been with MHRA since 2006. Next, we're gonna have Jennifer Evans. She's a compliance specialist for Health Canada. She has over a decade of industry experience prior to joining Health Canada in 2012. And last but not least, we'll have Richard Berning, who has served as an FDA investigator for over 13 years. Mr. Berning is currently on the OBIMO International Inspection Cadre, and he's conducted international inspections in more than 20 countries. All of these speakers have extensive experience in GCP inspections covering clinical investigators, sponsors, CROs, bioequivalence studies. So I encourage you all to read more about them on their speaker bios, which are posted online. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
So first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak again. I'm in essence just going to set the scene a little bit, really, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues. As we all know, the pandemic forced all of us to make significant changes to the way that we worked and our practices, whether that's as a regulator, whether that's as a sponsor, whether as a CRO, whatever. Life changed dramatically. Things like regulatory flexes, which I'll come on to in a little bit, appeared, and we all changed how we worked. But the purpose of this sort of session is to talk a little bit about what have we learnt, and what have we pulled out of this, and what have we retained going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about regulatory flexes. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we were forced to change our ways of working, and a little bit about our pre-pandemic activities and how that can be sort of carried over into where we are today. So March 2020, the world ground to a halt, as I'm sure you're all aware. Restrictions were imposed as the pandemic swept the globe, and suddenly our own little worlds changed overnight. You know, as an inspector, we were out and about. I just got my Chinese visa for a trip overseas. We were all ready, and then overnight you are grounded, you are going nowhere. Suddenly my wife had me at home quite a lot more than before, and I was constantly getting underfoot and therefore being given plenty of jobs to do. But things changed. You know, the kids were at home, and we're doing homeschooling. You know, the rise of Zoom and Teams and Skype and all of those kind of things. You know, we all had them. We were, you know, my parents were busy working out how to use their iPads. They could actually talk to us and this kind of thing. So life fundamentally changed. But in terms of visits, you know, hospitals are, if you just ever stand and watch the entrance to a hospital, you just watch swathes of people wandering in and out all day long. And suddenly there were no-go areas. You know, do you have COVID? Yes. You may end up at the hospital. If you don't have COVID, don't go near the hospital. And great swathes of the medical community were focused on or refocused on the provision of COVID care. You just look at who was dragged back into doing that kind of thing. But what did it mean for clinical trials? In essence, the nature of the pandemic and the need for social distancing meant that overnight things had to change. Prior to that, your investigator would see the patients, they'd go into the hospital, they were fundamentally linked with the trial site. Decentralized trials weren't really a thing, really. There were a few sort of attempts at it, but they were not common by any stretch. But the need to keep patients away from the hospital meant that lots of changes had to happen. You know, you had the fear of infection, trying to protect the clinicians that were there, trying to keep patients clear of COVID, all of that kind of thing. And then you had the refocusing of what trials were ongoing, what trials could continue to happen, but equally what needed to happen in order to support trying to get rid of COVID. So it was identified really early on that there was a real need for guidance to support sponsors as the world started locking down and people were looking at what can we do and how are we going to keep these things running. And so across the globe, guidance started to appear. So on the slide, you can see MHRA, FDA, Health Canada's regulatory flexes, which started to appear. And the purpose of this was really to support the efforts of those people conducting trials. So how can you keep your trial running as long as possible? Or to help you either suspend it, close it down. Certainly in the UK, there was a look at trials, whether or not where they were, whether they were likely to ever meet their expected outcomes and things. So some trials were just closed, others were mothballed, as well as trying to work with how might we run trials again in the future? You know, how might we run trials supporting COVID products? So just to give some examples, had all sorts of trial adaptations, so things like you could go ahead and change your visit schedule. You know, once upon a while, I'd see you every month. You know, come to my clinic, we'll measure some things, we'll talk about how you are, that kind of stuff. Now it was, I don't want to see you. And we're going to get rid of a whole load of these things that require you to come to the hospital. And perhaps there's other ways we can keep some of that ticking along. Remote visits became a thing. And much more than before, you know, often you'd get your research nurse perhaps ring the patient home, how you doing, you all right, you still with us, anything you need to tell us? That was almost the extent of your remote visit. But suddenly they became a real thing. You know, more and more discussions happened about what could be done at home. And you know, just looking on LinkedIn yesterday, there was a colleague from FDA talking about, you know, the potential for a trial in a box, which could be sent to a patient, and these kind of things. So they're really interesting thinking which has come from this. Informed consent, you know, we talked about e-consent before, I'll come back to that in a minute. IMP being shipped to patients' home or participants' homes directly. You know, I worked in hospital pharmacy before I became an inspector, and we used to send stuff to patients at home, mainly because they didn't want to stay and wait for the couple of hours it was going to take us to actually ship medication or to dispense their medication. We did it reluctantly, but we'd been doing it for years. All this was in essence, turning this into more of an established process. Same with safety reporting, do the best you can with what you have available, but we still need to know what's going on. Remote monitoring became much more of a thing. And then, in inverted commas, the acknowledgement of protocol deviations. Real life continues to happen. So do the best you can, and then we'll work with you with that. But what's quite interesting is that, in essence, there were plenty of prior enablers. So certainly in the UK, the legislation is broad. You know, it's very much high principle stuff. It doesn't say thou shalt do a thing, or at least generally it doesn't. It's pretty broad about how you conduct or can conduct a clinical trial, and that's deliberate because it enables all types of trials to happen, whether it's phase 1, first in man, all the way through to phase 4, and allowing all of those different types of work to occur. You know, MHRA has always been a pragmatic regulator, and like I said, regulations are generally high level, supported by detailed guidance, and that's where that comes from. So there's always been the ability, and I mentioned it in my previous talk, the ability to flex a little bit, to put in risk proportionality, risk adaptation. So that's always been there. The pandemic just forced people to have to adopt some of it because they had to continue to get their trials to work. In the UK, there was some previous pandemic legislation. Well, you know, 2009 avian flu, if anybody remembers that. There were a few bits and pieces that were bolted onto the legislation, not very much. If you look at it, it's a couple of sides of paper, changing a few bits and pieces, but mainly about labelling, a little bit about timelines for things like urgent safety measures and things. But people have started thinking about it. Some capacity existed within the system. And then, in some respects, this brings me probably to the biggest point of all in my presentation, is that times have changed in terms of technology, and we have all of these things available to us now, and they're much more established. Very, very few trials now run without any e-systems. You know, whether that's IRT, whether that's ECRF, ECOA, all those kind of things. There are so many e-systems out there now which allow alternative ways of working to occur. You know, e-consent, you know, we're busy talking about e-consent. In 2018, we published some guidance along with National Research Ethics Service in the UK about e-consent, but people just weren't picking up particularly quickly on using it. It's difficult. We don't know how it's going to come across. We don't know what it looks like. I don't know how to really put that in. And then suddenly you're in this world of, I've got to put it in because there's no other way of doing this. And so the pandemic became a crucible, really, of trial by fire, of you've got to get these things to work. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter how you're going to do it. You've got to adopt it and get on with it, or not run trials. So the next couple of slides really help set the scene a little bit, really. The clinical trial landscape was already, in some respects, in quite a good place. There was quite a lot of supported stuff sitting within it, but what it didn't have was the impetus to use a lot of it. But the pandemic required us to sort of get on and adopt a lot of these things, targeted trials. You know, suddenly you can't collect everything just because your patient's there. You've got to make trials as simple as possible. And I'm not saying that the pandemic trials themselves were simple. Some of them were incredibly complicated, but you had to really think about what you were collecting and how you were going to collect it. You needed to think about risk adaptation a lot more. How can we do as much as we can within the constraints we have, whilst making it deliverable by the trial teams, whilst making it simple for patients or participants to do their thing, and to have them as broad as possible. We need as many patients as we can get into the vaccine studies, all those kind of things. It forced the researchers to sort of adopt new ways of working, to think about alternative ways of working. You can't just have the participant rock up to clinic and then stab them for blood, measure a bunch of things, get them to fill in some questionnaires and send them on their way again. Suddenly you've got to be able to do all that lot in an alternative kind of way. And in some respects, it's stress tested some trial components. You know, there's been all sorts of things which have been in the regs for ages. You know, so assent by a legal guardian, been in the regs for ages, always been in there pretty much. But very few trials actually use it, whereas suddenly you're confronted by a patient population which you have to use this for. So how are you as an organisation going to manage it from a sponsor point of view, or as a trial site use it? Another interesting point is that it massively increased awareness of clinical trials. You know, suddenly my mum knew what I did and was able to talk about phases of a clinical trial. My children were talking about what was coming through from the vaccines and which ones they'd like, much as they thought they had a choice. But anyway, it was just a bit weird. But you suddenly had all this patient interest and involvement in clinical trials, which we don't routinely see. And that's something to make sure we continue to tap into, that patient awareness of what's going on. The general population is given this background knowledge. Certainly in the UK, you had, you know, the chief medical officer standing up talking about trials and putting up graphs of things and whatever. And that working knowledge, you know, the newspapers were full of clinical trial information and how trials work and this kind of thing. So hopefully that's whetted people's appetite for the future of getting involved in more clinical trials. It also forced sponsors to adapt and evolve. In the toolbox had often been e-consent and these kind of things, but they were very much that. They were, you know, at the back of the box, maybe back of the shelf, something for another day maybe is complicated, don't really have the time, don't really have the experience, not sure how a regulator is going to accept it, no idea how we might defend it on inspection, those kind of things. But suddenly you're forced to get them off the shelf and get on with it. And then work out how to use it effectively. And over time, people got better at it. But certainly out on inspection, looking at some of these things, some things worked well, other things didn't work so well. And e-consent or remote consent is a great example of that. For a lot of people, it worked well. They built systems to work with it. Others struggled a bit more with it. And certainly one of the sites we went to was a general practitioner, and we were listening to some phone calls made by a patient who was to be involved in a clinical trial. And listening to the conversation is real life. And the patient wanted to know one thing, the doctor wanted to tick some things off the list, but how the two were actually two very different conversations, all meant to be about the same thing, was really interesting. I think finally on this slide is to think about how, as a regulator, how we then work with applicants. And we see this sort of working through the system now. We do quite a lot of work with potential applicants for the future, so the sponsors of the time, support their setup and running of the COVID trials. You know, lots of scientific advice, lots of stage gating, submit the data you've got, let's see how we go. And that's provided much food for thought about future ways of working and sort of collaboration. How might we be able to do that in the future? Is that something we can build into some aspect of business as usual? But post-pandemic, you can't have all of these things running forever. And some of these needed to be tightened back up again. They were put in place to allow for a particular point in time. So some things were tightened back up again. Urgent safety measure reporting dropped back to its usual reporting timelines. Same with things like development safety update reports, again, were required within a time frame rather than just being when you can achieve it. But what we then started to see was this healthy growth in alternative ways of working as people worked through these things and went, decentralized trials, we can do that, virtual trials, all these different types of innovative trial designs, buckets, baskets, umbrellas, all these new terms which suddenly we had to come to terms with. We used at the beginning trial by fire, people worked through it and worked out what they were going to do with it. And now we start to see them in the common terminology we're discussing today. I suspect a good chunk of people in the room and certainly online now have some experience of these things, because they're no longer just an academic publication describing this is one alternative approach to running a clinical trial. You've probably either looked at it or have trials of your own which run using these alternative methods. Like I said, it brings us to alternative ways of working, so things like rolling review and this kind of thing, but also trying to push you to continue that sort of innovation. How else can you run clinical trials? What else can you do to make the participant journey as easy as possible, the investigator's journey as easy as possible, to streamline the data you capture to make sure you have what's important rather than just collecting everything in sight just because you can. And with that then brings good quality trials, good quality data collection, and useful tools and approaches for people to use. As I mentioned in my previous talk, E6R3 has taken on board some of these ideas and processes and dropped them in as well, and trying to provide useful guidance. And along the way, we all now have a little bit more working knowledge of them. So we bring our pandemic learning and experience to these things. So to summarise a little bit, many of the processes and approaches already existed. They were just sitting on the shelf waiting to be used, or for organisations to develop their experience of using them, and in some respects the courage to dust them off and give them a go. It massively forced everyone to evolve their processes and to look at alternative ways of doing things, and that feeds into risk-based trial design, that feeds into risk-based trial conduct, and also the further expansion of alternative ways of working. Just a few things to go and read, just some of the things I've mentioned along the way. And then my closing thought before I pass it on is that ultimately we all need to ensure that we've learned from our COVID-19 trial experiences and that we've evolved our practice and conduct by the development of innovative, effective and risk proportionate clinical trials. I just think it's so important that we use what we've learned, that it doesn't just go, times were different back then, it was a bit weird, a bit stressful, a bit different, but we're going to stop all of that lot and we're going to go back to the trials of yesteryear. I don't think that's the way forward. So I'd like to pass you now on to Jennifer, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Jason. Now we'll be doing the session topic from the Canadian point of view. So just an overview, talking about inspection changes during the pandemic, again, from the Canadian point of view. We'll introduce you to what's called compliance readiness inspections, or CRIs for short. And then we'll discuss some inspection changes post-pandemic, again, from the Canadian point of view. And we'll wrap it up with some real-world examples of CRIs via some case studies. So the Clinical Trial Compliance Program is a national coast-to-coast program, with our mandate being to promote and verify compliance of drug clinical trials against the Food and Drugs Act and associated regulations, including Part C, Division 5 of the Food and Drug Regulations, as well as good clinical practice. And how do we do this? We conduct inspections of the regulated parties conducting clinical trials. We develop guidance documents for the public to use to help with clinical trials, as well as compliance promotion, such as speaking today at today's symposium. So some inspection changes from the Canadian point of view during the pandemic. When it started, we halted all our on-site inspections, but we still wanted to ensure that the regulated parties were compliant with GCP and the clinical trial regulations. So we switched things up and we went remote as well as hybrid if an on-site portion was warranted. There was lots of players in the game. Everyone was kind of all hands on deck to solve the COVID-19 problem. So there was a lot of new stakeholders conducting clinical trials. And we also introduced new temporary regulatory measures called the interim order. We developed that as a regulatory flexibility. The first one in the spring of 2020, which was renewed with interim order number 2 in the spring of 2021. And we also developed remote compliance readiness inspections. We started them, and the first one being done in the fall of 2020. So a lot of things were happening in the first few months of the pandemic. Not too shabby considering the government historical speed with which they conduct new processes. So what are these compliance readiness inspections that we're talking about? As mentioned, they were a new inspection developed during the pandemic. Their purpose being to wanting to conduct them prior to participant enrollment. So no data was being reviewed with these types of inspections. We want to verify the site or the organization is actually ready to enroll and dose the participants. We want to ensure the sponsors and the sites that are conducting COVID-19 clinical trials are better prepared to meet GCP and Canadian regulatory requirements before they actually full on start their clinical trial, with the goal being to reduce non-compliances during the clinical trial. So the methodology we use for CRIs, we are focused on compliance readiness targeting human drug clinical trials, and this was in Canada. They were mostly done remotely in the beginning, did have the on-site or hybrid option if warranted. And the regulated parties we looked to inspect were the same ones that we were inspecting prior to the pandemic: sponsors, CROs, and qualified investigators, or PIs, as you call them in other jurisdictions, especially if it was a sponsor QI, as our regulations do not differentiate between commercial and non-commercial sponsors. And it's not, CRI is not really a quote, quote, full inspection. It's a shorter one over 2 to 3 days and 1 or 2 inspectors, as compared to a sponsor inspection, which is a systems-based inspection. You can have that anywhere from 5 to 10 days and with 2 or 3 sponsors, 2 or 3 inspectors, sorry. There's 3 main stages of the CRI. You've got the pre-inspection stage where you open the inspection, you're getting prepared. Then you have the inspection itself, starts with an opening meeting. Then you can conduct it remotely, on-site or hybrid options. Then you follow it at the end with a closing meeting. And then post-inspection, you're just closing out the inspection. So I'll go into a bit more details of those stages right now. So as mentioned, the pre-inspection stage, the inspector will select the regulated party and the study they are going to inspect. This is from an internal list of recommended studies. It's risk-based. Then they will contact the inspected party. They will introduce the CRI. They will ask questions about the stage of the clinical trial, the status of it. Just as mentioned, we'd like to have it before participants are enrolled. Not that we can't do a CRI if they have, but if they're near the end of the clinical trial, it wouldn't be as effective. Then they will kind of set tentative dates with the inspected party. And then once those dates are confirmed, the inspector will send a written notification letter and a CRI checklist. Go into a bit more detail about the checklist in the next slide. And then the inspector will do their preparation. They'll obtain information about the study from the Health Canada records, looking at the clinical trial application, reviewing the protocol and amendments, any sort of informed consent documentation, study drug information, what have you. And then the inspector will prepare their inspection plan. And we also do a presentation during the compliance readiness inspection, kind of introducing Health Canada, the regulations, and the notice that went out during the pandemic about management of clinical trials. We discussed that. So what is on a typical inspection plan? The checklist for a CRI. Now, this is areas that an inspector may focus. It's by no means an exhaustive list. It's not in any order of priority. It's just giving some examples. So as mentioned, we'll look at the status of the clinical trial, look for key dates. When did you get your ethics review approval? Did you do SIVs yet? When was your first dosing, if that has happened? How many sites are going to be involved, number of participants, et cetera. We'll also want to have a look at the organizational charts. Who are the key players? What are their responsibilities? A lot of review of the clinical trial procedures and plans, looking at key SOPs such as informed consent process, drug management. You'll have monitoring SOPs if you're involved with equipment and the maintenance and calibration of that. Training being another key one, how you're managing and reporting adverse events and so on, and record retention procedures. Monitoring plans would be one thing we'd want to review, various safety management plans, data management, IP management, risk management, et cetera plans. We'd be looking at the protocol and informed consent form and the investigator's brochure, see how they compare to what we have in our records to the current version that's being used in the trial. Looking at training records, and this can be very encompassing in that you're looking at the monitor's qualifications, CVs of study personnel, job descriptions, their training records in regards to study-specific training, GCP training, and in our case, Division 5 for the Canadian regulations. And in the interim order training, if they were conducting it during the pandemic under that pathway, as well as looking at if they've conducted an SIV documentation there, et cetera. Contracts and agreements between the sponsor and the investigator or an institution. If there's third parties involved, what are the delegated responsibilities there? And the investigational product label will also be reviewed because in Canada, we need it in both English and French. And then electronic systems, which ones are going to be used with this study? A list of them, what's their status? Have they been validated for their intended use and so on? So during the CRI itself, there'll be the opening meeting, introductions, explaining the purpose and scope of the inspection, explaining the inspector's authority to conduct the inspection, giving that presentation that I mentioned, and then the inspector will make their document requests accordingly. Then they'll get down to doing review of all those clinical trial documents they've requested. They may conduct interviews with key personnel if they need some further information and questions answered. And if there's any additional requests as a result of the initial review and interviews, that will be done during the inspection as well. And then at the end, the information will be consolidated and the findings that the inspector had during the course of the inspection will be summarized, and it's done verbally. And this is because there is no written inspection report that's issued from this type of inspection. There's no actually overall compliance rating for the inspection and no individual risk ratings for the findings. And as a result of the no inspection report, there's also no corrective and preventative action required to be submitted to Health Canada by the inspected party. And then post-inspection, within a few days of the inspection, the inspector will send a completion letter, written, usually sent via email. Then they will compile all the information from the inspection, summarize it in an internal database. This would be all the key dates, the documents that were sent to the inspected party, the various letters. If they've retained any documents from the inspection to support their findings, that will be saved and collected as well. And making notes about the status of the study, obviously all their findings from the study. And we'll save those relevant documents in our Health Canada repository. And as mentioned, there is no inspection report issued. And there's also no posting on the Health Canada website. Our other investigator inspections are publicly posted for you to review, but the CRI inspections are not. If there is any significant findings from the CRI, the place to note it is in this inspector summary, and they can then also recommend that a regular inspection be conducted in the future. So just some summaries of the CRIs. As mentioned, they were started during the pandemic, and it's to ensure the regulated party is better prepared to meet GCP and Canadian regulatory requirements. And we're targeting to do it before they've actively gone and conducted the clinical trial, because we want to reduce the likelihood of non-compliances during the inspection and protect the safety and rights of the participants, as well as generating valid clinical trial data. We have since expanded from initially doing only COVID clinical trials to doing other areas which we're seeing emerging non-compliance. And we're also doing CRIs with new sponsors and qualified investigators, because they seem to be a higher risk for non-compliances because of they're not as familiar with the regulations. So some inspection changes from the Canadian point of view post-pandemic. We've gone back to on-site inspections, but we are still continuing with remote and hybrid inspections. So we've got that inspection flexibility continuing. And we're continuing and expanding areas for new inspection options, bioequivalence inspections, medical device inspections, what have you. And the Canadian regulatory regulations are providing an alternative pathway. The interim order was changed into the COVID regulations, the clinical trials for medical devices and drugs relating to COVID-19 regulations, which came into effect in February 2022. This is continuing to facilitate the authorization and implementation of COVID-19 related clinical trials, and maintains the flexibilities that were set out in the interim order until the framework with the Clinical Trials Modernization Initiative is in place. And we're continuing our compliance readiness inspections post-pandemic. So now to get into some real-world examples from CRI inspections. These are actual regulated parties who were inspected, but no specific names or studies will be identified to protect the innocent or guilty. They're representatives of findings from our CRIs. We saw some kind of trends of common themes of findings. So case study A, the sponsor was new to clinical trials and not previously inspected by Health Canada. So that's one of our risk factors. They were conducting a COVID-related clinical trial. We conducted this CRI remotely during the pandemic. And as it turns out, we also did a regular sponsor inspection with this sponsor on site post-pandemic. It wasn't as a result of a recommendation from the CRI, it was just part of our regular inspection process. So we have kind of findings from both the CRI and the sponsor inspection to provide there. So some findings from the CRI. Their SOPs, plans, and other documents were mostly in place, so good on them. But they did have some miscellaneous issues with procedures, version controls, approvals, and they were missing some elements such as remote monitoring, which a lot of sponsors had to add a lot of remote elements, remote informed consent, as was previously mentioned, as well as remote monitoring. They had some document quality issues, drug accountability, delegation log, training records, etc. And they had no study team training on the Canadian regulations as it related to the interim order, which is what they were operating under, and the pharmacy manual. So as compared to some findings we found during the sponsor inspection, they had a CRO involved remotely, and we did have some deficiencies in some various areas with systems and procedures, the documents and safety data reviews as an example, the clinical trial plans, examples of monitoring and safety management, and the associated documentation had some deficiencies there, as well as the electronic system access and traceability had some deficiencies, and the training records and the training and associated records there also had some deficiencies. But overall, they had no critical observations. We don't overall rate our sponsor inspections, we just rate the observations and findings themselves. As mentioned, they had no critical ones. As compared to case study B, there's some similarities in the fact that they were new sponsor QI to clinical trials. We'd not previously inspected them. They were also conducting a COVID-related clinical trial. We didn't actually conduct a CRI on them. We found out about this sponsor and the issues from an internal referral, and a compliance verification was done at the end of the study. And so it was kind of a retrospective analysis of the issues. And the issues that we found with them is they were implementing protocol amendments without Health Canada approval, submitting notifications to Health Canada not within the regulatory timelines, and they had multiple other deficiencies under the Canadian regulations in various aspects: systems and procedures, training, protocol deviations, monitoring, investigator oversight, records management, to name a few. So in hindsight, this is a good example of a sponsor that may have benefited from a CRI. So they might have not had these issues during their clinical trial. Case study C is similar to the other two in that it was, again, a new sponsor QI to clinical trials. We'd not previously inspected them, but they were conducting a non-COVID clinical trial. It was an area of emerging concern. We also did this CRI remotely. It was just done post-pandemic. So some of the findings from that inspection: several documents, the SOPs, plans, et cetera, were not yet finalized or approved. They were missing many aspects there. The personnel had not all been selected or delegated properly, or any contracts in place. They had no ICH, GCP, or Canadian regulations training. And study drug documents were unclear or wrong or missing information. They were approved to conduct clinical trials. They'd gotten their no objection letter from Health Canada. So technically you should be ready and good to go. But as the CRI found out, they had several things that needed to be done before they could conduct a clinical trial without the potential for having lots of non-compliances. So we actually recommended for future inspection with this sponsor. So some takeaways from the case studies: we are finding non-compliances. But we're also finding that there's a learning experience for the regulated party. It's identifying improvements to make. The CRIs are not like a finger wagging type inspection. They're there to help ensure that the regulated party is better prepared to conduct the clinical trial and meet the GCP and regulatory requirements during the active or busy phase of the trial. We're also noticing that the lack of regulatory knowledge and clinical trial preparation can indeed lead to more observations and more major or critical observations. So thereby you have an increased likelihood of non-compliance, which can then lead to a risk to participant safety and data integrity. So to summarize overall from the Canadian perspective, our inspection strategy is more flexible in that we've got remote and hybrid inspections that we're conducting in addition to our traditional on-site inspections. And the compliance readiness inspection is a flexible option in our compliance toolbox, in that it's providing more clinical trial guidance upstream to hopefully therefore reduce non-compliances and issues downstream, while still looking to protect the participants' rights and safety and ensure valid clinical trial data. We also noticed that electronic documentation and systems are more commonplace from the paper way, from both the Health Canada and the regulated party perspective, which we're finding easier, faster, more efficient communication and document sharing and record retention aspects. So if you have any questions about that or the session, please provide them to the Q&A panel at the end of today. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass it over to Richard for the FDA perspective for this session.
Sorry. Thank you, Jennifer and Jason. Let's click it forward. All right. So I'm Rick Berning. Nice to meet you all. As Iram said in her introduction to me, I sit in the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations within ORA, and just for the international attendees who might not be familiar with that function, ORA is kind of our boots on the ground. We do the on-site inspections, and within OBIMO, I monitor international inspection cadre, so I'm dedicated to doing mostly international inspections. So I'm going to do this summary of pre- and post-COVID inspection activities from my personal perspective, the boots on the ground. Click through. All right, so we'll go through a brief overview of the development and implementation of remote regulatory assessments during the pandemic, and then move on to my boots on the ground perspective on what typical inspections have looked like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And the typical disclaimer, these are my personal perspectives and opinions on the matter and not representative of FDA. All right, so we've talked a little bit about these remote regulatory assessments, or RRAs, and we will continue to talk about them in future presentations, so I will not dwell on the topic for too long. But for my participation, these are one of the biggest innovations for FDA during the pandemic from an OBIMO standpoint, because inspections were not possible at the time. And they're a useful, if somewhat limited tool. They're still being adapted for continued use in the post-pandemic era. By design, they were not intended to create an undue burden on inspection sites, on the study sites, as many international clinical investigator sites simply are not equipped to facilitate the types of things like scanning an entire study's worth of documentation to submit electronically to then talk about on video conferences. So due to this, we had to be very thoughtful about exactly what we wanted to look at during these focused reviews. And we had to make sure that we scheduled times for interviews that were compatible with the global facilities and that they would be able to talk via interpreter usually as the documentation that we wanted to know. This was a lot of late nights and early mornings. These are better than nothing, but they don't afford such an in-depth review as an inspection. All right, and just like everybody else, FDA had to develop policies and procedures in real time during the pandemic, and bioresearch monitoring, even within FDA, had different needs in other areas. Many of the different arms of FDA utilize these RRAs, and they were trying to figure out if they were a good fit, even the CIFSAN and CDRH, everybody else. I know CDER and BIMO, we definitely went fully on board with these during the pandemic. And we're still continuing to adapt it. Recently, in October 2023, FDA issued a new draft guidance for industry that discusses RAs by a new moniker of Remote Interactive Evaluations, or RAEs. This will be covered in further presentations. So I'll move on to my particular focus, which is the investigator perspective. I'll go through an overview of what typical inspections consisted of pre-pandemic and how innovations such as decentralized trial structures and implementation of digital health technologies have changed these inspections post-COVID. So pre-pandemic, reason, highly centralized, data usually created, kept at investigator sites, and the subjects typically seen exclusively at a study site. These are the classic study types that most of us have been familiar with over the years. At the investigator site level or clinical bioequivalence inspection level, you will find that the vast majority of study data is generated locally. Exceptions to that may be IVRS or central lab evaluations. This is a potentially burdensome setup for the study sites from a data collection standpoint, and potentially burdensome to study subjects by virtue of the required travel distance and just the frequency of coming to the study site for visit after visit after visit. And so by that nature, it can reduce the potential number of subjects that may be able to access and participate in the trial. But from my perspective, I used to like those. Be fairly efficient inspection study sites. You could just show up, walk in the door. That pretty much everything you want to look at to ensure the review is adequate is at the site. And as we've talked about during these other presentations, post-pandemic, there's an increase in the decentralization of these clinical trials. And it had been on the horizon prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but as others have stated and illustrated in the presentations, the need to continue clinical research trials had to be properly balanced while ensuring subject safety and also maintaining the quality of the research. And so there was a push to decentralize these clinical trials, and it felt like a fast forward button was pushed. And as inspections have returned to normal from late 2021 to present, more and more of the work I do involves a trial with at least one or more decentralized elements. To date, I've yet to fully encounter a fully decentralized trial. The hybrid model seems to be the preferred one based on my particular experience. So FDA published numerous updates to the COVID-19 clinical trials conduct guidance during the pandemic. This is to aid sponsors in minimizing disruption to clinical trials. Ideas such as the remote informed consent, remote telehealth visits, remote monitoring, home healthcare evaluations, and remote data capture via digital health technologies, they began to enter the mainstream as there were practical applications of the need to protect the health of study subjects and continue research activities. And the flexibility that was afforded to industry and researchers during the pandemic further to shift into the decentralized clinical trials. And in my view, it won't return to the pre-pandemic structures. And once this flexibility was used to demonstrate that the changes in research design and conduct could be effective and reliable, a return to the old paradigm seems improbable. And FDA has continued to develop further guidance for industry as the interest in these areas continues. Just last year in 2023, we provided updated guidance documents on decentralized clinical trials, the use of real-world data and real-world evidence, and the use of digital health technologies in drug development and clinical investigations. And these were rolled out to continue to provide current agency thinking on these topics due to the increased interest and utilization of all aspects of the research that got a jumpstart during the pandemic. The decentralized approach can offer greater access to participation in clinical trial and reduce subject burdens, as previously outlined. But there are certainly some growing pains involved, as the burden can move from the subject to the study site. Some study sites I've seen have shown struggles with adapting to telehealth and remote monitoring systems, as investigators are used to maintaining greater direct control over study activities simply by virtue of them being conducted within their institutions. And while remote monitoring can be an effective tool to evaluate compliance with study activities, I've observed that it can be harder to identify site noncompliance and implement corrective actions without a personal presence at the site that is conducting a study outside of its usual scope. Think of sites where they're taking on new studies outside of their typical function areas, they have a higher enrollment population in a particular trial, or stricter blinding criteria. If monitoring isn't happening at appropriate intervals at these sites, problems can persist and multiply. Proper risk assessment is critical when implementing monitoring plans, and considerations need to be given to the site's ability to adapt to new study structures and equipment. And from my end, decentralized trials can be harder on the FDA inspection side. My overarching goal is the same on an inspection now as it was 5 years ago. I try to meet the requested level of review from the center issuing the inspection assignment memorandum to me, and make sure that subject safety and rights are protected, and that all the data generated from application is accurate and true to the best extent possible. In a centralized trial, I can do all that from one place when I show up. In the decentralized environment, when I arrive at the study site, I have to begin the inspection by confirming what the responsibilities at a site or a sponsor actually were for a given study or studies. And then once I establish that, I have to determine what data I can properly assess from what the inspected entity is responsible for. These days, it feels like I spend more time sifting through system audit trails, user acceptance testing, or data transfer specs, or a receipt confirmation than I do reviewing site records. And part of the difficulty for FDA in particular is that unlike some of our regulatory counterparts, we cannot request documents to review ahead of time on these inspections. And for me, when I'm on a foreign site, I have my week to get in, do the work, and get out. So any requests for information from a vendor, such as audit trails or user acceptance testing, they have to be made after the inspection opening, which immediately puts me at a time crunch. We have to make judgment calls on where the inspection time should be focused and use our spidey sense, as others have called it, to try to locate the problem areas at an inspection site as quickly as possible. The above changes primarily apply to clinical investigator and sponsor inspections. The bioequivalence inspections I've done post-pandemic, they're still predominantly the same. Their structure doesn't really lend themselves to decentralization. And the majority of the BEQ centers I go to, they still rely on manpower and paper records to get the job done. All right, continuing the theme to DHTs, others covered electronic patient reporting outcomes and standalone devices for recording subject source data. And as I was saying, my recent inspections have mostly reflected this shift towards decentralization of study setup and implementation of DHTs. The data gathering technologies such as electronic patient reported outcomes feel nearly ubiquitous these days. And remote gathering of information such as blood glucose levels or blood pressure levels are something I see more of lately as well. But again, with this push to use these data gathering techniques, it comes the burden of understanding the use of it at the site level. Investigator sites that are used to seeing their subjects in person need to be properly trained on the use of the DHTs, as well as the responsibility for the oversight of the use of these devices on the subject end. And at the sponsor level, consideration must be given to the intended purposes and functions of the technology. Just a few issues I have seen in person, particular to ePro systems. I've seen ePro help desk users that are given edit access when the subjects call in and ask for help. But when the help desk user made the change, it persisted as the subject making the entry as opposed to the help desk user. I've also seen ePro systems that, by design, they requested large, consistent amounts of event reporting from subjects, and specifically subject caregivers in a sick pediatric population. And the same system prevented entry of information after 48 hours, leading to underreporting of events that had to be corrected after the fact. In that situation, there was no consideration given to the caregiver probably putting more focus on caring for the child than just churning data into an ePro. And I've also seen ePro systems where subjects are not trained on the proper reporting of the events that require modifications down the line, and it creates a large amount of event adjudication later. And typically with checking that the study step through the portal and has to get re-verified on inspection. So these three top issues are ones that should have been considered in the design of the study prior to the implementation of the ePro. And from where I stand, the newness of the implementation on both sides and the general increase in the number of data movement pathways in these decentralized trials, it opens the door for errors that can affect data integrity and subject privacy. This increase in the number of potential vendors and systems used in clinical trials creates more potential pitfalls. Each link in the chain may work on the assumption that the next link is doing their job adequately with adequate systems of protection in place, but that's not always the case. And these weak links in the chain are something that I always put a heavy focus on when I show up at a sponsor or clinical investigator site. Changing the topic to real-world data, real-world evidence. I haven't done any of these inspections personally. It feels like industry is keen to leverage these large data sources where possible to support marketing applications. These sources can be very challenging to verify from an inspection standpoint. The collection of data, the ownership and maintenance of data sources such as oncology registries, just for example, pose challenges in the verification of the integrity of the data, and selection bias is a concern, as is proper consent for the use of the data and protection of the privacy of the individuals whose data was collected for this registry that was not necessarily intended for inclusion in a marketing application. And I'd like to add another perspective from some of my colleagues. During meetings and discussions with colleagues about recent inspections in the post-pandemic era, I've also observed there's a split in their comfort levels of performing electronic data review. While it's an area that I'm keenly interested in, and I love diving deep into it, and I focus on it on every inspection, the fact is that until recently, OBIMO did not even have permission to access read-only systems and had to rely on over-the-shoulder activities to review vast TMFs and things like that. So the rise of the decentralization of trials and the implementation of all these numerous data streams to track and verify on an inspection, it's generated like a real interest and a need and increased data integrity training for our inspectorate to continue to be flexible and adapt to new ways of keeping inspections efficient, to review as much of the critical data as possible while on site in our limited time. Continuous training is a cornerstone of any enterprise, and regulatory inspections are no different. The changing landscape of clinical trials in the post-pandemic is certainly keeping us on our heels while doing our part to ensure that data quality is coming from the trials. All right. So we've reached the end of my brief overview of my personal view of these. So in summary, decentralization and the use of digital health technologies in clinical trials, they only appear to be increasing in scope. And they do offer real tangible benefits to study subjects and to study sites if they are properly organized, trained, and monitored for compliance with the study protocol. And RRAs or RAEs now are a new tool in our tool belt to evaluate compliance with regulations and are continuing to evolve in their function and scope. Keep your ears up for much more information on these in the coming presentations. And from my point of view, while decentralization and digital health technologies can be beneficial to sites and subjects, they do appear to be making FDA inspections of sites and sponsors more burdensome, especially in the international inspection area where you cannot feasibly extend inspection times. Careful planning and constant evaluation of where inspection focus should be spent is critical to properly gauge an inspection site's compliance with their responsibilities for a clinical trial and ensuring that the integrity of critical study data has been preserved throughout all phases of generation, storage, movement, and analysis. I'll leave you with the closing thought that the pandemic presented numerous challenges, but as long as we keep subject safety and rights and quality data control, I should add that in there, at the forefront, innovation can only improve the output of clinical research as long as regulatory review practices adapt accordingly. All right. Look forward to any of your questions later.